Sit, please. Please sit. Have a
Seat.
seat. Thank you. Fourth classman Poe, E.A. Poe, Edgar A. Poe.
The Pale Blue Eye premiered on Netflix in January 2023 and became an instant hit to kick off the new year. The story revolves around Detective Landor, played by Christian Bale, a former police officer who has been hired to look into a mysterious murder at the prestigious West Point Military Academy. There, he befriends a young cadet who's also a writer. His name? Edgar Allan Poe. Poe seems to have some insight into the ritualistic style of murder. The victim's heart has been cut out. As the story progresses, it becomes a whodunit, with questionable clues arising about Mr. Poe himself. Poe receives insight from his dreams, which manifest into his writing. He's able to commune with the dead in his sleep, which brings him the truth of the identity of the murderer. The movie opens with a quote from an 1844 short story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Premature Burial. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? However, we're not going to discuss all the finer details of this movie here today. We're going to look at the poetry and literature by Edgar Allan Poe that was brought to this movie. The Pale Blue Eye is actually based on a 2003 novel by the same name by Louis Bayard. Interestingly, the poem recited by Poe for his lady love Leah in the film, and not actually based on one of Poe's poems either.
Down, down, down came the hot, threshing flurry. Heart, I beseeched her to hurry. Lenore. She forbore the reply. Endless night caught her then in its slurry, shrouding all but her pale blue eye. Darkest night, black with hell, charneled fury, leaving only that deathly blue eye.
This is not to say that his work is not included in the film. The film was not based on one specific story of Poe's, but rather sprinkled in with different works by the infamous writer. The Pale Blue Eye is mentioned in his short story, The Telltale Heart. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. This story tells of the narrator of the tale who is obsessed with the pale blue eye of an old man he knows. The story ends with the old man's murder and the confession by the mad protagonist to the officers investigating the crime.
Who was she?
You may have caught the line connecting the love interest in the movie, Leah, to someone Poe has often written about, Lenore. Though The Pale Blue Eye is not originally one of Poe's works, the poem connects to Leah's haunting beauty, her blonde hair and large blue eyes, which he is enamored by. Lenore was a poem by Edgar Allan Poe about the tragic death of his true love. Many believe that this was written about his wife, Virginia, who died of tuberculosis in 1847. Wretches! Ye loved her for her wealth, and hated her for her pride, and when she fell in feeble health, ye blessed her that she died. How shall the ritual then be read? The requiem how be sung by you, by yours, the evil eye, by yours, the slanderous tongue, that did to death the innocent that died, and died so young. The movie, The Pale Blue Eye, surrounds the concepts of illness and death, with Poe's love interest suffering from, perhaps, epilepsy. The film takes a supernatural turn, which you can find inspired in many of his works. Edgar Allan Poe seems haunted by supernatural phenomena, death, and illness, which was included in so much of his writing. He not only lost his wife, but also tragically lost his brother in 1831. And, much like as the movie emphasized, Poe was profoundly affected by the death of his mother, Eliza Poe, in 1811. She also died of tuberculosis, and afterwards Edgar, his brother, and his sister were all split up and sent to different families. This clearly lent itself to his melancholy writing, which focused so heavily upon the recurring theme of death. In his poem The Raven, he again brings up the loss of Lenore. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, and for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And finally, as Edgar Allan Poe tells Detective Landor in The Pale Blue Eye, he will write something about him. He does not fail, and in the book titled Landor's Cottage, he goes into great detail about a journey through the picturesque forest along his way to find a cottage in the middle of a glen, surrounded by the murmur of water and the true beauty of nature so close to a busy civilization. On this peninsula stood a dwelling house, and when I say this house, like the infernal terrace seen by Vathek, I mean merely that its tout ensemble struck me with the keenest sense of combined novelty and propriety, in a word, of poetry, for, than in the words just employed, I could scarcely give of poetry in the abstract a more rigorous definition, and I do not mean that merely outer was perceptible in any respect. In fact, nothing could well be more simple, more utterly unpretending than this cottage. Its marvelous effect lay altogether in its artistic arrangement as a picture. I could have fancied, while I looked at it, that some eminent landscape painter had built it with his brush. Landor's Cottage is a short story with the protagonist wandering from a road into the otherworldly environment of the flowering forest, which leads him to a lake, before discovering the cottage. At the cottage, he finds a friendly mastiff and is greeted by a young woman, presumably inspired by Matilda in the movie, who leads him to Mr. Landor. The story ends just after meeting Landor, finishing with, "It is not the purpose of this work to do more than give in detail a picture of Mr. Landor's residence as I found it, how he made it what it was, and why, with some particulars of Mr. Landor himself, may possibly form the subject of another article."
Books! Oh.
The Pale Blue Eye was an excellent movie which gives insight into much of Edgar Allan Poe's writing and inspiration. The story did a fantastic job of bringing Poe to life and tying in so much of his work while building the story around it. The story was full of twists and turns and shined through as compelling as one of Poe's mysteries. While he's better known for his work in the horror genre, Poe was also accomplished in writing mysteries and crime stories. Arthur Conan Doyle, the other father of crime fiction as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, said about Edgar Allan Poe, "Each of his detective stories is a root from which a whole literature has developed. Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" As a former poetry kid who spent their share of time reading Edgar Allan Poe in the local cemetery and trying to be goth as hell, this movie really captured Poe as a quirky and insightful character rather than just a depressed emo drunkard. Harry Melling was the perfect casting, and he brought Poe to life in a way that was even better than I could have ever expected. But what do you all think? Did you enjoy The Pale Blue Eye? Would you like to hear the full version of these poems as recordings here on the channel? Let me know your thoughts and questions in the comments below. And please like and subscribe for more content like this. And consider joining my Patreon to help support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Was it Poe?
Bye.
The heart is a symbol, or it is nothing. Now take away the symbol, and what do you have?